I just want to start by reading a passage, and then if it's okay if I pray. And this is how I tend to think about oppression in the church. It says from Ecclesiastes 4, "Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressor, and they have no comforter." And I just am so encouraged to be able to sit here and realize that you guys are going to be comforters. And that's just a blessing to me. It's a blessing to the church. I'm just going to open this up with prayer, if that's okay. Father God, I ask for your mercy and your tenderness as we are together this morning, having to look at something horrible first thing in the morning. But I pray for pastors. I pray for helpers, for women in this room who when I speak, certain individuals are going to come into their mind. So I ask that you would give them the wisdom they need for the particular situations that they face, that we would become a people who tenderly comfort the oppressed and lovingly correct oppressors, to the glory of your name and for your church. Amen. So I just want to start off by saying Jesus loved his church, right? And she's not always a lovely thing. But the love and the care and the passion for his church is just so clear. I love the church, and I just want to be really clear with that. And when I was setting up my talk, I thought, how in the best way can I help you all? And what I was thinking is I really wanted to combat some common mistakes that I see pastors and churches and women in ministry, women's ministers making just because they're unfamiliar. Sadly, when I consult with churches, oftentimes I'm working with pastors and they have tears in their eyes for what they didn't know, what they didn't even know to look for, or what they couldn't have even imagined. So that's kind of my goal here. I'm thinking oftentimes we miss oppression because we underestimate the extent of evil. If you don't practice in evil, you can't even imagine the corruption and the distortion. And I understand that. Nor do often churches understand the extent of manipulation that a victim faces, that the oppressor will do to the process or to the pastor himself. Oftentimes, once you're engaging with oppressors and it's not going well, they actually turn on the church and create all sorts of division, and that's usually when the light bulbs go off, right? But now we have a bigger church problem. And I just want to help you guys avoid some of those things. I'm just going to back up for a minute, and we're going to talk about things that we all know, basic theology, that we were all created to worship God and to love others, right? We are created to worship our Creator. And anytime our desires point away from God and we put it towards a false God, we get into trouble. This is just basic, right? And the second greatest commandment, I think, sums it up the best. We were created to love God, greatest commandment, love God and love others. And how we love others really showcases how well we love the Lord. Marriage has this great ability to highlight our deficiencies because it's our closest neighbor. And so when we fail to love people well, you can advance the slide, sorry. When we fail to love people well, it's going to expose our idols. And what I want to say this morning is that I know we all struggle with idolatry, but not all our idols are the same, right? Some are different. So I might be in a marriage where I have two idols that are competing, right? So it's typically how we've thought about how I was trained to do marriage counseling. I desire comfort. I'm a homeschooling mom. At the end of the day, I'd be like to my husband, when are you going to be home? He'd say 10 minutes. I'm like, well, what street are you on? Like, I'm desperate. I need you here. And he'd walk in the door, and sometimes I'd have to take a break. That was me. And it was sweet of him to love and care for me. But if I was demanding in that, right, and he was late, then that would be me saying, my comfort is more important than your well-being or my children. And so we all have this. We all have healthy desires to be married, to have children, to want harmony in our homes. And Ed Welch talks about the descent of a desire, where he says, there's things I desire, and then they become wants, and then they needs, and then I demand. And it's usually when we get into that demand section is when things get easily corrupted. But today we're even going to go in the sub-basement of past that, where it's I will wound and punish to get what I want. And that's what abuse says. So we know as we're ministering to people, and Mike Emlet, a colleague of mine, he puts it this way, we're always looking at people as a sufferer, a saint, and a sinner. And people are all three. And so we're always looking to redeem worshipers, right? Connecting a person with spiritual truths, improving their relationship with the Lord, and in presence with abuse. The only difference is we're still about reclaiming worshipers. The only difference is now we're having to add an extra layer of safety. We have to start thinking about safety. We're still addressing both the oppressor and the oppressed as a sinner, a saint, and a sufferer. But because of safety, we're going to have to prioritize those things differently. And I'm going to draw that out throughout the lecture. And you can keep... I don't know how to keep advancing my slides. Do you want me to? Do you want me just to signal you? Raise a hand? All right, so we'll go ahead one more. Sorry. So marriage is ultimately about God and his glory. We all know this, but if we sit back and think about it, when God created marriage, he already had Christ and his church in mind. And that every time I think about it, it just blows my mind. And it was in the purpose to create a picture of Christ and his relationship with the church. And what a beautiful thing, right? And we think about, what is that? How did Christ love his church? He was faithful, he was sacrificing, accepting, honoring, serving, honest, and caring. But when we're going to talk about abuse today, we're going to see the exact opposite of all those things. We're going to see people who are disloyal, who are exploitative, rejecting, disgracing, withholding, deceptive, and cruel in ways that you can't even imagine. So I just want to frame, really, abuse is the exact opposite of what God intended. So we all have this universal experience. You don't even have to be married to know that being in a relationship with someone realizes your idols, right? And even though we're going to talk about not doing marriage counseling or relationship work, it's really important that we think about that I know that we're all married to an idol worshiper. My husband knows it, right? There's certain things that my comfort, it hurts him, it costs him. And so, again, marriage is just exposing our idols. But what I think is really important, and what I didn't understand when I first started marriage counseling, is that not all sin is the same. Sometimes you have two idolatrous people in a marriage who are having relationships problems, not because of how their sin intersects. Sometimes we can actually have somebody who is suffering in a marriage because of one person's sin is more pervasive and sets the climate of a marriage. So you think about it, if you're married to a pornographer, right? You can be a good and godly wife and with sin issues, but until that pornography issue is addressed, the marriage really can't be improved. Or if you're married to somebody who's going to be a spendaholic, right? There's certain things, or a gambler, that are just going to set the dynamics of the marriage apart. So not all marriage problems are mutual idolatries. And I think that's just important. That's the way I was trained. When I first had a couple sitting in front of me, I remember one couple in particular, she sat there, she took up like no space in the room and just didn't move, hardly spoke. And her husband just kept saying to me, she's cold as a fish. She doesn't love me. Sometime 10 years ago, she just stopped loving me. And so my counsel to her was, yeah, I'm looking at her. She doesn't look like she's warm towards him. She's not moving. She's not talking. And I said to her, maybe you should really just go home and work on engaging him more, cook him a favorite dinner, plan a special date. I had no idea of the brutality that she was facing at home. So all I did in that moment was I served his idols. He fed her on a platter to me. He manipulated me. I told her to go home and do what he had been asking, right? And I hear that all the time. My wife doesn't have enough sex, right? We usually say, well, it's good. Sex is good. Have more sex. Do I want to ask somebody, well, what does that mean? What are you saying more sex? What do you mean? Well, 3 times a day in the middle of the night. Well, that's totally different, right? So if we don't ask questions, if we don't peel back layers, if we're not trained to look for certain things, we make assumptions based on our own life. In my advice, as bad as it was, would have served well in my marriage where my husband cares about me. He would have delighted in me serving him that way. He wouldn't have weaponized the counseling. So what I'm trying to suggest today is I want to peel back attitudes to help you see dynamics so that you don't make the horrible mistakes that I have. We're going to go to the slide that says key attitudes from people who oppress. Oh, you have a clicker? Oh, thank you. Lord. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I'm getting all crazy. All right. Note to self, buy clicker. I didn't know I needed one. I would have had one. All right, so key attitudes of people who oppress, and I think this is really important. In the mini book that was shown, Recognize, Respond, and Rescue, I go into a biblical theology behind all this, and it's 8,000 words, and it's great. It trains everyone in your church. Really quick little read. But I just want to summarize it today to give us an understanding of orienting what is going on the heart of someone who oppresses. It's very complex in a lot of ways. And so they have particular ways that they relate to other people. They feel entitled. So I counseled a man, Peter, and he just felt very entitled in the sense that he wanted his home the way he wanted it. He would always buy the biggest, I would say his television was like 60-something inches, and his wife shopped in thrift stores. He wanted to entertain and have people over late at night, and she had to get up at 4 a.m. for work. And she said, honey, could your friends leave at 9 so I could get up? No. She had to clean the house, not a problem, but if it didn't meet his standards, he became enraged. One time she actually fell and shattered her elbow, and she was a data entry person. And he would not pay for her physical therapy, even though her job paid for their health insurance. So she actually had to do overtime hours with a busted arm to pay for her own physical therapy. She had like 32 pieces of metal in her elbow, right? But he didn't want it to infringe on his fun, his party, his ability to have his play money. He was also very domineering. So he would tell her how to cut her hair, when she could and couldn't see her family. And if she wanted to go to her family, say for Christmas, and he was not pleased with that, and she would go anyway, he would put up quite a stink. He would embarrass her. There'd be some huge argument. He would taunt her father. It would just become impossible. He figured out how to get his way by being very domineering. And then he threatened her. If you do this, I'm going to tell the pastor about your sexual sin as a child. If you complain, I'm going to let your best friend know this about you. So in a sense, these little attitudes, or large attitudes, how they relate to other people, they really are enslave the person that they're in relationship. They are willing to wound someone to maintain power and control. And if we think about it again, this is the exact opposite of who Christ is, right? Because he was willing to be wounded for those that he loved. So again, it's just this incredible opposite. Now, we all sin. Like, I can be entitled at moments. I like certain things a certain way. But usually, my little one will say to me, Mommy, my heart is soft as petal. If someone tells me I hurt them, it grieves me. I feel sad. It might take me longer some days, shorter in other days, but I have an awareness and a brokenness about it. People who oppress tend not to. Because what I say is they are greatly self-deceived. They are blind, and this is hard for us to understand because they're doing these overtly horrible things, and yet they don't make the connection that they're wrong in doing them. And they really have this rightness about them. It's really hard to understand. They also tend to have a lack of remorse for others, and by that I mean they don't really have empathy for the wounds that they cause. They might have a remorsefulness for a self-pity. Right? I often see a lot of tears when I work with oppressors, and it's more like, I just want my world back to the way I want it. Fix this. But it's not an articulated, I understand that when I stood over her screaming, I made her afraid. Those things are not usually articulated. It's more of a self-pity, because, right, sin makes a fool of us, and even oppressors know that. And the other one is they are master blame shifters. We saw this in the garden. Right? But they are masterful at it, and their behavior is rarely their fault, and it's usually their spouse's. And so if I sum up all these behaviors, they're self-justifying, which really puts them in a very dangerous spiritual position because they don't have a problem with their own anger. They always have a problem with someone else's behavior. Peter was fantastic. He could rattle off his wife's failings like this. She was unpleasant, unkind. She's just a daddy's girl. She never really bonded with me. But again, they are so self-righteous. They don't see their need of Jesus. And so I have deep concern for where they are spiritually. Oh, and I can click. Haha. So happy. All right, so the way I conceptualize, and I think this is helpful, and I think this is what Scripture says if we spend more time looking at it, and if you work with oppressors and you see patterns of oppressive people in Scripture, which I don't have time to go all through, but they really usurp God's position, and they live out life as if they are the ones to be worshipped and obeyed, right? Because it's only their rules in their homes that need to be followed. And I hear all sorts of rules, crazy rules, like you can't have leftovers. Your underwear has to be folded a certain way. You have to stir your tea, but the spoon can't hit the clank. Right? And then I want to back up and say, I have what I would say, we all have preferences, right? So I wouldn't call it a rule, but I have a preference for how I like my dishwasher loaded, right? It just works if the top shelf, the glasses are all a certain way. But if my husband comes home and serves me by loading the dishwasher and he does it differently, I don't pick up the glasses and throw them at him, right? I don't punish him for breaking my rules. I might say to him, hey, this is really important to me. Can you help me in this way? I might just change the glasses, right? There's a lot of ways I can respond to having my preference, the godly ways, to having my preferences not met. Again, it's only their words that need to be heard and obeyed. They often interrupt, they mock, they roll their eyes. And as you're interacting with them yourselves and trying to minister to them, you will see that. They are unbridled people, as I would say the Scripture says. And it's only their emotions that are under consideration in relationship. A couple weeks ago, I was sitting with a woman whose son was going through something quite traumatic, and she was sitting next to her husband, and the way that he relates to her is what I would call gross indifference. He doesn't really engage with her in any way. He treats her basically as a non-person. So she was sitting there and just overcome with emotion and crying and crying and crying. He didn't offer her a tissue, didn't even say a word. She stopped crying after about 10 minutes and just got up. And it's just so sad. But again, the week prior, she did not make him peanut butter cookies, she made him chocolate chip cookies, and he felt so unloved because if he really loved her, she would have known which one to make, right? And they had to have a 3-hour conversation about how she failed to love. And then it's only their physical and sexual needs that need to be fulfilled. And I do, in my work counseling Christian women, I would say about 70% of the women I see are sexually abused by their Christian husbands. And I find that somehow Christian men know not to leave a bruise, or if they do, it's on the middle of the back. But they can emotionally and spiritually abuse, but you realize the sexual abuse is just entitlement in the bedroom, right? I deserve, I need, I want. And our culture talks about sex as a need. So I'm just bringing that up. But again, I don't consider this covenantal living. This is enslavement when you have to work hard to keep someone from punishing you. So an oppressor has so prioritized their own needs that the primary existence of others is to fulfill their desires, right? And when they fail to do so, there's a reprimand. And so it sounds like this: give me what I want or you will get punished. And it doesn't always have to be overt. It doesn't even have to be spoken. I had a woman who I counseled several years ago whose husband had beaten her early on in the marriage, and all he had to do then was kind of clench his fist. He never really had to say another word. He just signaled to her, not happy, or tightened his jaw. And in severe cases, it can look like this: unless you make me or keep me happy, I'm going to make you miserable. So again, how do we think about it? Because abuse is largely unseen, right? The public face of an oppressor is delightful. They are some of the best elders, deacons, pick up the widow, take everybody to the airport runs, take everybody out for dinner. They can be very charismatic, very deceiving. And one thing I really feel my heart breaks for churches is you realize in order to see oppression, you have to disbelieve everything you already know about this person to be true. Can they really be evil? Can they really be doing these things at home? I don't ever see a whiff of it when I'm out with them at church. Really? Like, it's really hard to believe. So we don't even necessarily see the punishing and controlling behaviors that are going on. And that's why I wanted to spend some time talking about the entitlement and self-worship, because sometimes we can pick up on that. We can pick up on that when we're in a small group and someone sometimes is over-talking, or they are very firm about their opinions and they're not good at listening to other people. Sometimes we can start to see the patterns in other hidden places. And how do they enforce worship? All different ways. And not all punishments are physical, and I think this is really important. Oftentimes, it's just telling lies. Oftentimes it's saying, I never said that. I didn't yell at you last night. I don't know what you're talking about. It's very disorienting for victims. Sometimes it's a silent treatment. They might not talk to their spouse for a day or 4 days, a couple hours. All sorts of ways that people are wounded, that in non-physical ways that we have to become alert to. But again, I just want you to know that these things people do to rule over other people. But again, if I'm hurt, I might go quiet in my marriage, like for a couple minutes, sit on the couch and have to process and think through. But I come back, or my husband says, hey, right? I'm not doing it to punish him. So again, there's such a wisdom issue that we can be seeing these things in a marriage. It doesn't necessarily mean it's abusive. So I don't want you to hear me saying things that I'm not saying. We have to figure out how things function in a marriage. Is it used to control? Is it used to wound? So then I just want to talk about briefly, what's your call? If there are marriages in your midst where people are enslaved to an oppressor, and I love this verse from Hebrews, remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and which suffer adversity, as being yourselves also in the body. And we are called to get close, to get up and personal, to know what it is like. And it is hard. It is hard to ask the layer of questions that you need to ask. It is hard to imagine what people are going through. But I think this is what God calls us to. I really feel if we look at how we are to image God, right? We are to worship him in so many ways. And I love when he introduces himself to Moses. He says, I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come to deliver them. Right? God introduces himself to Moses as a deliverer. He is not concerned with Moses' personal sin in that moment, which is often we are tempted to do because it's so much easier to take an oppressed person and tell them to go home and what to do. And it's so much harder to guide an oppressor. But what God does is he says, your suffering moves me, and I come to deliver you. And oftentimes in this type of ministry, the priority has to be to alleviate the suffering. And we worship God when we are deliverers for his oppressed people of all types. And even as he's telling, right, the Israelites to go, his purpose is what? Let them go so that they may serve me. Again, I'm just casting this vision that doing this type of counseling in your church or working in this is an act of worship because you're restoring, you're reclaiming worshipers, you're expanding the kingdom. Now this is where things get kind of sad. And bear with me for a minute because we're going to talk about the fact that sufferers are everywhere. 25% of marriages are abusive. If you think about that for a moment, it's quite overwhelming. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men report being victims of physical violence, contact sexual violence, stalking, resulting in injury, fear, or concerns of safety. And I have counseled Christian men who have been oppressed. It's easier for me to talk in one gender. But this statistic is also higher because that will encapsulate the world statistics where there's male-on-male violence. But nearly 1 in 4 women experience severe physical violence in their lifetime. That means that they've been hit with a fist or a hard object, their hair is pulled, they've been slammed up against something, they've been choked, suffocated, burned, used a knife or a gun. So I think it's important that we recognize it's severe. These terms kind of get crazy because when I have to do the research, the world doesn't even talk about marriages anymore. It's like intimate partner violence, right? So as a Christian, it's very difficult. And violence, when they're saying physical violence all the time, domestic violence doesn't just include violent behavior, it just includes also abusive behavior, right? Because so just bear with me with these crazy statistics. And I wanted to highlight this for you in your churches too, because 50% of men who assault their wives also frequently assault their children. So this is not just a marriage issue, it's a family issue. And one of the things that I have seen, because I've counseled some women over a series of years, is as their children grow up and are released into the world, they renounce their faith. If that's what Christianity looks like, what came out of my dad, I want nothing to do with it. And that has just been grievous, and it grieves them because they thought, I'm staying with my husband, I'm enduring these horrible things for the sake of my children. And I'm having to counsel their children who have then been in an abusive dating relationship, who have been choked, who are now doing drugs, right, to cope with the trauma that they experienced as a child. Now this is even sadder because sufferers sit in our pews. The abuse rates are the same in the church, and I was sitting there going, when Brian was saying his first thing, alcoholism rates are the same, drug rates are the same, divorce rates are the same as the world. I'm going to be, it's going to be a little bit easier for me to say abuse rates are the same in the church. This is really hard to believe. So it's okay if you don't believe me. Still take those numbers and cut them in half. It's still hideous, right? So I want you to pause for a minute and think about the size of your church. My church is about a church of 400, and these statistics come from Holcomb, and a great book, Isn't My Fault. He's an Episcopal priest from, I think RTS is where he works and writes out of. But I think this is great just to open our eyes and awareness, because it's not something we see. We can't imagine that it's happening. So in a church of 400, you'd have about 160 women and 20 teenage girls. About 40 of those women would experience physical violence in their lifetime. So do the math. Do you have to divide by 2, multiply by 3, depending on the size of your church, and just think about that. 20 would be currently experiencing physical abuse. 20 women. 4 to 5 teenage girls in your pews will be experiencing dating violence. And if you were to factor in emotional or verbal abuse, you would about have 80 women suffering in your congregation. 60 men in your pews would have assaulted their partner. It's just likely that you're going to have active abusers going on. 30% of Americans in general say they know someone who has been physically abused in the last year. It is staggering. And when I look at my church, at first when I was reading this, and this is what I do for a living, I'm like, this is ridiculous. But then I started to count on my hand. I was like, nope. And these are the ones that I know about that are coming forward. So it is ringing true. Another research project, RAVE, says about, that interviewed pastors. They said that pastors believed, who were aware of the issue, 1 in 5, they would find about 5 couples a year they'd be dealing with abuse. They'd see about a 20% rate in their church. And so why is church education so vital? Because studies show that Christian women seek help from an abusive marriage. They ordinarily contact their pastor or another woman in their church first, which is fantastic, right? We think about, we have these suffering people and they're going to trust us with their stories. This is wonderful. The sad things are, and they're really looking, whatever the pastor or their friend tells them is going to determine their next steps, right? So we have to know when we enter in, what we say is going to have tremendous impact. And yet, 95% of women say they do not know what their church thinks about domestic violence. They don't hear it talked about. They've never heard a specific sermon on it. And I'm not a topical sermon person, but I look at the Bible and there's a lot of abusive power and control going on, right? It's a lot of evil. It's very easy to make little applications here and there. And sadly, religious women are often told that the priority of the marriage is more important than exposing sin, right? And protecting their children, protecting their lives. And I think in part because we don't ask that second question. Well, when I'm thinking about a woman who came up to me and says, what does your husband do when you come home late? Does he get mad at you? It's really easy to be like, sometimes he's really inconvenienced, and the question should be, well, what happens to you when you do? Women often float these little trial balloons. They never tell you their story. They always just give you a little balloon and see what you do with it. I have so many women that I counsel say, well, I kind of asked my best friend, or I was going to women's Bible study and I put this question out there years ago and I got this answer back that just said, submit better. You just have to give more sex. You just have to be more loving, use a better tone. So I went home and for the next 5 years, that's what I tried doing. but nobody ever stopped and slowed down and asked the next question. Well, what's really happening in your home? Why are you asking me that question? I think it's helpful to have a good definition of domestic violence, because again, I talk about it as domestic abuse because I feel like it covers more. I love the word oppression. Obviously, you hear me using that. I feel like that's a biblical category. It captures the domination quite well. But what is it? It's a pattern, and I think that's really important, right? It's not an event. It's a pattern. It's something that's going to happen over and over and over again of coercing and controlling of abusive behavior that is used by an individual to gain maintain power and control over another individual in the context of an intimate relationship, right? And these behaviors can include many things, but they're intended to frighten, intimidate, terrorize, exploit, manipulate, hurt, humiliate, blame, injure, wound an intimate partner. And again, these are the various types. In the mini book, I go into them. I don't have time to go into all of them today. Financial abuse, I think, is helpful to draw out, though, because 99% of people who are abused are also financially abused. Financial abuse is something easy to document. So when you get into the church discipline process, there's usually a paper trail, right? There's usually something that happens in that financial, somebody's abusing credit, somebody's restricting money. I've had women say, at the end of the month, I have to beg my husband for $5 for sanitary products. I've had women come to me and say they have a pre-filled out check to come counsel me because their husband doesn't trust them to carry a checkbook. I've been told I'm not allowed to drive more than 5 miles a day. My husband fills up my gas every Tuesday to make sure the odometer is in check. Right? These are sometimes as sick as they are, or particularly I had one woman, she had to return in every receipt. Well, okay, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. A lot of people use mint, we use envelopes, right? So I didn't necessarily think anything of it. After talking to her for a little while, I realized he would go through it line by line by line and berate her. They had like 8 children. She'd like overspent $3 and he would go ballistic, right? That's not budgeting, right? So again, we have to ask questions. We have to say, well, what happens when? And that's really difficult because oftentimes as counselors and pastors, when we're looking at disagreements, what are we looking for? The content. Where is a disagreement? We're looking at, we want to know what people are disagreeing about. We don't step back and ask the question of, what does the conflict look like? So detective abuse, you kind of have to get the screenplay of the situation in the home. So what happened? Where was he sitting when this happened? Well, he was following me around the house and cornered me, right? Well, what did it look like? You said he was angry. How long did that last? 3 days, right? So you're trying to get a different level of information. It's not just, oftentimes we just want to solve the problem. Well, we can just sit down with the deacon and we can we'll do a new budget. Right? It's a great solution. But if you don't understand the screenplay, what it looks like in the house, then we're prone to make lots of mistakes. And again, accuracy is extremely important, and that's why I'm saying we have to get that screenplay. We have to ask other questions, because perception does not always equal reality. And does that make us comfortable? How uncomfortable is that for you to have to minister blindly to people? What you perceive is not necessarily what's happening. How difficult is that? Secondly, there's not always a definite criteria which allows us to recognize abuse, right? I don't think everyone in this room would agree with me on when something becomes abusive. I think we're all going to agree that when someone's choked, right, or beaten, they're abused. But when we're looking at emotional abuse, we might vary. We might even vary when I have a lot of women who sit in cars. If there's an argument, the husband drives erratically and he's trying to frighten them. Now that might alarm me because I've seen that pattern over and over and over again. But for some of you, that might be like, well, he's just a rage-filled driver. Like, how do you know, Darby, that that's a pointed behavior, right? So it takes us all, the beautiful thing is we can just slow down. We just have to gather information. And it's okay that people on your session don't all agree. Right? And just love the people around you and just slow down and ask the right question. It's about finding that punishment cycle. And I said it's the same thing, like when I think about when is a spanking gone too far, right? It's somewhere before welts has happened, right? But again, we're not all I don't spank my children, but we're not all going to agree when that has gone too far, right? We're just going to be different. we have to understand that when it's used to control and dominate. So just like a range, there's a range of anger, right? If I'm grumbling and complaining is a form of anger, that's low grade, rolling eyes, yelling, right? There's a broad spectrum. Abuse kind of exists in the same way. And not all oppressors are the same. If you've seen one oppressor in one marriage, you've seen one abusive marriage. And I think that's helpful. So sometimes we just have a spectrum of abuse is what I like to call it. So I was talking about entitlement as the core attitude. Sometimes we're looking at people whose behaviors, as we start to unpack them, they're not really abusive. They might be someone living on the Asperger spectrum that really can't emotionally connect with their spouse, right? And there we're about educating, we're about teaching. Same thing with someone who grew up in a family that's historical. They just have weaknesses where the father came home and he was served, right? That's more of a cultural thing. Again, that can be taught to. Or just an immaturity, like a lot of young men come home and they just think they can play video games for 8 hours and they forget that they're married, right? So when you can co-intervene in those marriages, it's fantastic because usually there's sorrow, there's insight, they might resist a little bit, but there's usually teachability there. When we start to call it abusive, we start to look at where the entitlement is in the slaving entitlement, because we're all entitled people, right? We all want our world a certain way, but when it becomes abuse is when my entitlements enslave the people around me. And then we can have people exploitative, like the example of Peter. He just used his wife for her health insurance, her income, her house cleaning. And then there's manipulative, where you get more into that mental abuse, where people are being told they're crazy. And then it gets more dangerous as a person lacks empathy when they're doing damage to someone and it causes them they don't care. There's just a hardness of their heart there. And then there's abuse that's cruel and dangerous, right? And that's where we're looking at people. I've had men come into the house in the middle of the night, turn off the power, scurry throughout the house, try to scare their wives. That's the choking, the marital rape, right? So not all abuse happens, and we can see that over time. We could see why a heart would get hardened and get worse. But I just want to point out too, there's also things that make abuse worse. So if you have any compounding sins, like addiction or pornography, that's usually going to escalate the abuse. I mean, pornography just fuels entitlement. Now, not all people who use pornography are abusers, right? So please don't hear me saying that. But if you are a person that uses pornography and is also an abuser, it is very difficult, right? Because that you're just getting fed that entitlement on every thing. And you actually have to address, before you can address the abuse, you actually have to address the pornography addiction or the drug addiction. Not that we don't address the abusive behaviors, but recognizing it's just going to take so much longer. And yet you can have somebody who's living on the spectrum of abuse, but they might actually be in distress for what the harm that they're causing their family. That actually lowers the intensity. And I think that's helpful. Like if you can see people who are actually identifying, this is doing damage and it bothers me, help me, right? That's when they're trying to turn the corner. I'm just going to skip that. So what I'm trying to say is it's really complicated. I'm trying to overwhelm you a little bit. I'm not giving you a clear answer. I'm not giving you a clear line. When I go to churches or I get a call from a pastor, they always wanted me to say, when is something abusive? And I can't, right? It has to be about that particular relationship, how behaviors are functioning. But what I can tell you, one way to really unpack it well is to look at the effect that the abuse is having on the person who is being oppressed. So I'm going to take Sandra. I counseled her for a long time, and she, as a young woman, she was just a sweet-spirited, vivacious, outdoor-loving, lovely person. And over time in community, I saw her kind of withdraw. She stopped going to Bible study. She became more anxious. Her husband came home. She didn't want to hang out with him anymore. Her husband had to start going to small group by himself. And a friend actually came to me and said, could you help her? I really feel like her anxiety is taking over. She looks like she's losing her faith. I'm really worried about her. So her friend group really just felt like her faith was falling away, and they were very concerned about her. So I sat with her probably couple weeks, And she just kept talking about this intense pressure that she would feel. And her husband was one of these people in the church that, again, picked up everybody at the airport, took the widow out for dinner, went to sporting events, had just huge camaraderie with people, and he just looked fantastic. And so we started charting some. She started getting these strange physical symptoms. We started charting some of these physical symptoms, and she would get a migraine at the end of the day. And I started realizing, oh, that's when husband's coming home. So every day her body was saying to her, I'm done. So then I started asking, well, what happens when your husband comes home? Well, I have to be at the door. I have to kiss him. Okay, nothing wrong with that, right? People want to be greeted when they come home. I have to be dressed a certain way. The house has to look a certain way. The kids have to just drop what they're doing at 2 and 3. 3-year-olds don't drop what they're doing all the time. Sometimes they do, Daddy, right? Sometimes they're in the midst, right? Anyway, so she just painted this picture. She says, you know what, Darby, I just feel like I have to keep my home as this 5-star spa. And if he comes home and the towels in the bathroom aren't just so, he picks them up and throws them in my face. I just feel like a slave. And again, I'd be in church, I'd hear other women talking about this person saying, we're really worried about her. She's married to the greatest man. If I had this man who brought me all these gifts, I'd be blah, 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 blah. And so she just couldn't even go to women's Bible study anymore because the people around her, she couldn't relate to them. She felt condemned. She was judged by them. Again, I probably worked with her for about 2 more years before I found out there was a marital rape on the honeymoon. And that is sadly common. So she learned really early, I either give in or it's going to get ugly, right? And he, thankfully, was able to admit that, right? Which made it very much easier on the church and me. But you realize she's 10 years into a marriage where she doesn't feel like she can say no. She's coerced, and then all of a sudden we started unpacking all this coercive sexual abuse. Started to make sense of everything. Now, what happened in the church? Did they ever know about the sexual abuse in the marriage? Never. So when she leaves, who gets excommunicated? Right? She's pursued. So then we kind of go into the pastor. I say, hey, pastor, you know this is going on. Elder's like, oh, totally different situation. We're going to slow way down. Well, what happened to her socially in the church? Because does the church ever know what really happened in her home? So now she's out of the church. She's lost her friends. They're judging her. They're judging the pastor. There's division, right? The people working with, he's just so good at spinning the story, right? That it's just creating all sorts of relational conflict in the church. And the pastor can't defend himself and say, this is why we've made this decision, right? So these things get really difficult, and they're not just hard on us, but they're hard on the people in our pews. So we want to be really careful. So what does it look like to be controlled? And Sandra did this quite well. She looked hopeless. She was extremely depressed. In fact, I later figured out she had a suicide attempt at one point. Conflicts with her spirituality, loss of friends, inability to regulate her emotions. She slept, in her case, she slept too little, but you could sleep too much, you could eat too much, you could eat too little, couldn't concentrate, all sorts of avoidance going on. Now, some women look completely the opposite. They look like they're outraged, right? So it's not always that they get meek and frail and overcome. Sometimes they can get quite angry, which is a good response, actually. Filled with anxiety, flashbacks, and then sometimes people cope, they don't do well. Like they might have an affair. I remember one woman who was married to a man that just brutalized her. She, on her way out, she had an affair with the Marine Corps Navy SEAL. He was a Navy SEAL, actually. Now, is that a godly response to being abused? No. Did it make sense to me? She feared for her life? Yes, right? So again, we're trying to slow down and understand what it's like for these people and trying to love them well. And so these are just 4 simple questions you can ask. Have you ever been threatened or physically hurt in a relationship? Can you ask an abused person if they're abused? No. Why not? Most women, when they come to me for being abused, don't tell me they're abused, just like Sandra. They come to me for anxiety, fear. They don't even recognize what's happening that to them is wrong. The other thing you can say, have you ever been an unwilling participant in a sexual act? You don't want to say, does your husband violate you? They don't experience it as violation. They experience it as duty, right? Do you ever feel fearful around your partner? Again, these are just bland ways of drawing out stories that don't assign a moral value that they don't have to their situation. Do you have the freedom to be yourself, make decisions, give your input, or say no to things? And then it's really, again, it's the examples. These are simple yes or no questions, but it's going to be about the example. And then I just want to caution us, because we all have this idea of what a church-like woman looks like, right? She's respectful, she's humble, she's got a solid identity in Jesus, she's loving, she's yielded, she's empowered. When you're abused, you're kind of fall on the other side of that, right? You're insecure, you're unsure, you're nervous. You can be unloving of your spouse, fearful of them, self-protective. They don't look like a good woman. But I also want to caution to us is sometimes when people are coming forward in abuse, they don't fall on the other side. They fall in the strong, unsubmissive quadrant, right? Because they figured out what's happening. So they're disrespectful, they're opinionated, they're contentious, they're prideful, right? And one of my first counseling cases a pastor handed me was like, I can't take this woman anymore, she's so angry, right? Well, I figured out over time, we're so angry because of what we're enduring at home, and she's finally figured it out. But again, it's us slowing down. So I just want to point out a few things when we're working with the oppressed. Honest speech can be uncomfortable for us when they start talking about what's happening, their anger at that. But it is vital, right? Their sin has been in hiding and not saying what's happening. So just sit with the uncomfortability. Don't try to shape the speech too soon. God allows us to express our hearts and trust that he's going to help them lament and shape it later. We need to be mindful that abuse distorts key things in a person. They don't know who they are. They're told they're repulsive, they're unloving, unlovable, right? So they don't even feel that they can ask God for help. So they have no idea what they should be doing. If they don't know who you are, who God is, how he thinks of you, it's impossible. They don't really see any choices. I'm stuck in this marriage. It feels like a lot of people say to me, it's a slow death. It feels like I'm slowly dying. I had a woman I worked with whose husband pointed a loaded gun at her and the scope was on her, right? Took her 2 years to leave. Everyone else is saying, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just leave? Well, he might kill me if I leave. So I have to leave secretly and quietly and plan it. I have children that I'm going to have to share custody with, right? These are not things that we can just tell people what to do. Their oppressors already doing that, right? So we have to slow down. But we have to realize no matter what choice they make, there's tons of pain. They stay or they go. They are in an impossible situation. What happens to us who don't live in this world where we're oppressed and enslaved and fearful, we look at them and say, well, why are you staying? You must be codependent. If you trusted God more, you would just leave, right? Submit better. How did you provoke him? Just to stop provoking him. He'll stop being angry if you stop provoking him. You're just oversensitive, right? Because we are looking at messy people, kind of like Sandra, and we're not understanding all of their wounds. And I love when Job, right? Job does a great job saying to his friends who offered him poor advice, right? Started to question his faith, right? He says, you are miserable comforters, all of you, right? And we don't want to be miserable comforters. So what do we tell victims? Well, first we have to be, and I say, we have to make ourselves really small. And that's the beauty of this work, is we get to embody Jesus in ways. It shapes us. When we think of Christ and his coming for us, he came to us, he made himself tiny so we could relate to him. We have to sit with oppressed women, and our person has to be smaller. We have to listen, right? Jesus listens. He draws people out. And these are the things that we want to be saying eventually. It's not your fault. Abuse is inexcusable, right? Nothing you have ever done, ever, makes you deserving of abusive treatment, right? Scripture is clear, right? What comes out of a person's heart is the evil thoughts that are within them. And we're recognizing they live with so much shame, right? And shame, guilt says, is easy, because guilt says you did something wrong. I can repent of that. I can fix that. Shame says you are wrong. And I love the way Ed Welsh says it. He says, shame is life-dominating and stubborn. Once entrenched in your heart and mind, it is a squatter that refuses to leave. So you think about a woman being shamed for 1 year, 5 years, 20 years. And now all of a sudden you have to have, as an elder or a pastor, you have her in your office. And you keep saying, God loves you. And she's like, yeah. Right? You have to say it's just impenetrable. So I just want to encourage you, never tire of speaking truths to these women. It is going to be slow and agonizing for you. But we think about Scripture as a whole, it's highly repetitive, right? Because God loves us that much to repeat himself over and over and over again. So be repetitive. God has unimaginable patience with us. We have to extend that same grace. And again, it's just about going slow and being repetitive. And that's usually when I get calls from pastors, well, I've been meeting with her for 2 years now. That's wonderful. But they don't recognize, just because something hasn't changed, they don't recognize the benefit of what they're doing. It is a long and slow process. So I just want to encourage you in that. And just remind them that this is not what God intended. This oppression violates God's design for marriage. That's just words that give life to women, and victims. You're not called to submit to unrampant sinful behavior. Just simple. God cares about safety, right? These are just simple things. God's desire is to rescue his people, like I read from Exodus earlier. But in Luke 4, it talks about, Jesus says, he has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, to free those who are oppressed. Jesus is all about rescuing his people. And oppressors are much more difficult. They're a little bit more stubborn because of their blindness. And just to review who these people are, right? These are the things that they're saying. I was created to be worshiped, not as a worshiper. My words are the most wise and true words. Everyone should worship me and work to bring me glory and honor. My thoughts and opinions are perfect. I don't require forgiveness. I don't hurt others. They injure me. My expectations are reasonable. My care of others is impeccable. And all of creation exists for me to serve my needs and wants. And what's important about this is as you enter and to move to them, that's all going to bend right back on you. So 2 things I want you to know about oppressors is they will work tirelessly so that you feel sorry for them. I have seen tears, manipulative tears. I love tears of repentance, don't get me wrong. But they will paint their wife to be such the person of their torment, and they are very good at it, right? And if you're not focused on their behaviors, if you let them take you down all the rabbit trails of their life, well, I just don't know how to deal with my feelings, right? You'll spend hours and hours not working on the abuse. You will get lost in their labyrinth. So just a few cautions as you're working with oppressors. You want to be careful you don't enforce their rules like I have historically done. Feed their entitlements. You want to be really careful that you don't want to let them blame their spouse. She gave me no choice. She's so frustrating. I had no choice but to pop her one. What do you mean you had no choice to pop her one, right? Well, you have to focus on the behavior, their behavior and not their spouse's behavior. What they often have is a pronoun problem. It's she. It's never I, right? And that's hard to do when you're talking to someone because they're usually setting the agenda. I can't tell you, oftentimes when a couple comes in and the husband brings a book, I'm like, uh-oh. That's a red flag for me. I really need you to teach my wife how to communicate better. I really need you to teach her to submit better. He's already trying to control me. Now, has everyone that's brought me a book been an oppressive man? No. But that's a red flag for me to start to ask questions because they're trying to control me to control her. And then we can't counsel them as a couple, right? That's obvious because the advice that I'm giving is going to get weaponized. It's not a joint problem, and it makes the illusion that it is. Again, I've talked about how it's manipulated. So what can you do? And then this is really helpful because we're trying to just unearth it. You want to come up with a concrete plan. You need to say to oppressors, you have to ask them specific things. I want you to meet with this man on Thursday mornings for breakfast. I want you to read this book. Because they will resist being steered and discipled. And that's going to help you see who they are. Again, this is 2 years typically before an oppressive man has insight that he's an oppressor. So this is a long haul. So you have to think about, how am I going to care about this family? Can this wife stay in this environment for this long while we're seeing if he's repentant? And we want to be working on minimizing the punishing behaviors. The only person that knows if that's happening is who? Spouse. They can come and tell you all sorts of stories. I bought her flowers last week. right? I've done this, I've done that. The only person that really knows is their spouse, so you really have to check in with them. So again, we're just thinking about how do we concretely help them give up power. So I say to a husband who's economically abusive, you're not allowed to ask for receipts anymore, right? Just basic things. Help them give up control and commitment to safety. Oftentimes we have to have a safety plan. I don't have time to go into all of that. There's great ones online, but safety plan doesn't always mean separation and safety. Safety plan can also mean when there's a conflict in your home, this has to happen. Don't fight in the kitchen. There's lots of knives in the kitchen, right? There's all sorts of things that we can do to coach to safety, even while people are still married. And again, part of that, and I just want to encourage you to plan for and protect the unity of the leadership in the church and the body in that, because as this starts to play out, it gets tricky. And I just want to mention this today because I don't think a lot of people understand. We know that the cycle of violence and domestic violence is predictable, that there's an incident, there's an explosion, something happens, and then there's a period of remorse, and then there's a tension building phase. What I have seen churches do is after an acute explosion, someone was telling me last week, their pastor, another counselor, a man actually strangled his 8-month pregnant wife, right? So she was going to go to the police, right? Pastor met with him. Pastor's like, he seemed really repentant. He seemed really sorrowful. He cried for 20 minutes, right? I don't think we should call the police right now. What pastor did not understand is that there's always a period of remorse where they're trying to get things back to the way they wanted it. Other pastors don't understand. They say, there's an explosive incident, but she provoked him. Oftentimes, wives do provoke because they feel it coming, and tomorrow's Johnny's birthday, and I'd rather have the explosion today than I'd have it tomorrow, right? So actually, sometimes provoking is a way of resisting being abused, right? So we really have to understand how the cycle of violence works, and that repentance has to be long and sustained. Like, apology of words is not sufficient. And this is the other thing I wanted to leave you with just the idea of violence, and I don't think we think about this, it always picks up where it leaves off. So if I've been in an argument with my husband and he's throwing things at me, the next time he's going to be throwing things at me. If it raises to the point where he's hitting me in the face, he's not going to go back to throwing things. It's going to start at the same intensity. And so there's certain things. So anytime that you hit object with a closed fist, but anytime anything's beating up, being threatened with a weapon, attempted strangulation, injury with a weapon, like the next couple steps are death. So I feel like I'm giving you not enough information this morning, but I do want to make sure that we understand how violence works. But what can also happen is someone can go from not doing anything to strangulation. You don't necessarily have to hit all those steps. So plan accordingly. Right? So we are using violence to maintain control. Herod did it, right? He killed all the babies. Haman didn't because Mordecai didn't kill all the Jews. We often fail to see that violence is used. We think it's a temper, an explosion. It's just angry. They're out of control. The Bible says, nuh-uh. We use violence to maintain control. And that's just really important. I'm just going to skip through this. Yeah. So as you're working with them, usually this is where the light bulbs go off, usually where this is connected, it's how they're responding to the counseling that they're getting, to the care plan that they're getting. Are they being justified? Are they bringing us an agenda? Are they twisting their words? Are they continuing to play the victim? Are they blame shifting to you? Are they really slippery with their words? Is it a twisted sense of sorrow? That's where you're going to get a sense of who they really are. And lastly, I just want to leave you with this. So given the misery that I exposed you to all this morning and how pervasive that system is for oppressors, I just want you to think about what are ideal components in shepherding an oppressive marriage. So how do we treat victims? You want to listen to them. You want to believe them. Like I said, you want to make yourself really small. And yes, then verify. But at that initial disclosure, don't ask questions that insinuate, I don't believe you. Just ask for more details. Instead of hearing one incident, say, well, has it ever happened before? Tell me about other times. Ask for more information. Don't question about that particular incident. You have plenty of time to verify. Keep notes. Go over safety plans and concerns. Then you have to decide. A lot of women say, I'm telling you this, but I don't want you to tell my husband. A confrontation would make my life hell. I can't do it. It's too hard. So oftentimes people come forward and we can't do anything with that information. That's really difficult. But they know their situation better than you do. And over time, maybe you're counseling them or they're working with a counselor and things can change and be stabilized. Again, what do we do to support them? We just continually ask, you follow up. A lot of these women, they come forward and then we don't see them for a while. But we have to follow up, right? They don't look like they're bleeding. So I would say put them in your calendar. Make sure you check in from time to time. Give them practical relief. Pay for counseling. Get a babysitter for counseling. And have them over for dinner. Build a team to support them. This is a ministry you cannot do alone. It takes too long. It's too tiring. And again, develop a ministry plan to wisely confront an oppressor. And I would just want to say, you don't always have to say to them, hey, you're abusive. It's not helpful. Right? It's going to be really off-putting. You might say, hey, I noticed the way you talk to your wife. It seemed, you're just really critical. That was really brutal when you called her this. I heard you use this word, this word, this word, and this word. You seem to be really limiting her freedoms. Those are actually, when you start to talk about what an oppressor does, it's actually worse when you use the actual verbs of the actual things that they're doing. But it's more concrete for them. They're just going to get really defensive if you use the word abuse with them. And again, you just the quicker you can get to a detailed plan with them, the better off you're going to be. And the other critical thing, just thinking about your churches, is you want to close the information loop, because wife's going to be over here telling her story, husband's going to be over here trying to hide, then his story gets exposed, then there's going to be men in the church coming, elders having breakfast, leaning in on him. All of a sudden, man's going to want to really be discipled. He's going to meet with 5 more men in church and tell a totally different story, right? I remember one time working a case with my husband. Woman came to me and said, I had my husband disciple the man. They were meeting for breakfast. He's like, my wife is just so unreasonable. She has me clean the bathroom. It's ridiculous. I get home from work. I've worked a 10-hour day, and I have to do a chore, and they're sitting on the couch watching television. So, okay, what did I get wrong? Go back, ask the wife. Oh, well, he has cleaned the half bath. It takes him 2 hours. Oh, okay, so there's something else going on. Went back to but my husband and I were starting to have these really big disagreements. She's crazy. She was yelling at me. She didn't let my kid help me. Step back, ask the wife, what was going on? Well, he asked our son, who's highly allergic, to carry a canoe, and it was covered with pollen. So I told the child to get back in the house. My husband and I had 2 totally different versions, right? So I'm just encouraging you to loop back, loop back, loop back. Because I love your churches, and I love my husband and I have a great marriage. And if we could get there like that, right? Just want to warn you about that. I'm going to end it there. Just enough. I don't even know if we have time for questions, but go ahead.
Not a question, but thank you for your compassion and your courage to look into evil. Just thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, no. I'll stay up here and answer questions for a few minutes, but I know you guys need a break. But if anyone, go ahead. If you could step out if you want to.
Smaller churches where we have team put in place, absolutely. There's a point of referral.
So you need to know your counselors. You need to make sure it's a counselor that understands abuse, because when I was a young counselor, I didn't, right? So call up counseling centers, batter intervention programs, your local shelter oftentimes. Call them and just ask them a question. This is my situation. What do you think? Help me do a safety. Because a lot of this, especially when it gets dangerous, we're not experts and we don't want to pretend that we know things we don't. So yeah, just think community. Yep. Go ahead.
When you are trying to get other people involved in this, as a team, do you always have to ask permission for this?
Yeah, so you can just say, this is how I work. Right? And you always want to guard an oppressed person's safety and her secrecy. You don't want to be emailing or texting or, but yeah, consent. And oftentimes you say to an oppressor, hey, you're starting this process with us, you need to sign this off. And they might just be like, Well, how important is your marriage then? Yep, go ahead.
The traits you mentioned of an abuser sound a lot like a narcissist. Are there any connections there?
Sure. I mean, right? You have an entitled person and a self-absorbed person. They're close cousins. You can have narcissistic abusers, right? There's differences, but yeah, they are.
With that, when you're kind of trying to confront an abuser, don't refer to them as an abuser. Correct. But can you tell them their behavior is not okay?
Absolutely, and firmly.
Yeah.
We're very concerned about you. Yep. Go ahead.
So much work being done in like premarital stuff, because I know that this also is in relationships, premarital relationships, that people won't leave because of the different power control issues or guilt or whatever. Yeah. But
That's a great
any
point.
work being done in there.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I have like an inventory. It's on my, actually, darbystrickland.com. If you go there, all the slides will be there. But there's also an inventory you can use for premarital counseling there. Oftentimes in dating, it looks like passion. It looks like jealousy. It's exciting, right? The abusive behaviors, the things that are dominating, come across as passion. They don't come across as abuse. I want to know where you are all the time. I'm checking your phone because I'm jealous. I couldn't stand, right? I'm showing up unexpectedly at your work because I'm so in love with you, right? It doesn't really feel like control until they have you sometimes. Yeah. Go ahead.
I do appreciate your talk to Darby. The news shows that so-and-so murdered his wife. And there was a restraining order. Correct. So I think we're all probably not naive about just the limitations of our law enforcement, just resources being at the door of every household. But nevertheless, as a pastor and as counselors, once that assessment of both the spouses determines that there's been physical violence, I'm inclined to dial 911. Absolutely. And in the use of the law, not only to restrain people, but also to bring about the need of amendments. But that there's no waiting till the top of that chart where death occurs. I think I need to hear that. We need to dial.
We need to report crimes. Now, adult abuse, if she doesn't press charges, that might put her in more danger. So we have to think, but that's where your local shelter, the domestic violence, the police can even help you think that through. Absolutely. And then that's when sometimes a safety plan, she can't go to someone in the church's house. She has to go to a shelter where they have cameras, depending on the level, right? So there's all sorts of extractions. It's very complex because a restraining order oftentimes is just not helpful. Yeah, but necessary. Other thoughts? Yeah.
When you've had someone come to you who you feel like she's being emotionally abused and wants wondering about divorce, how do you usually?
So I get to play them a woman card. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not an elder. I'm not a pastor. So what I will do is I will say, that is a great question for your church leadership. This is, I know that you're experiencing is not God's design for marriage. Just because it's emotional abuse does not mean it's not severe enough to warrant, right? It's about the damage being done to that person. But let's sit down with your pastors and let's talk about what your church has to say about that. And it takes me probably about 10, 20 conversations. It's not an easy question. And then elders and pastors really have to wrestle through their doctrines, what the Bible says, and it's difficult. And I think churches are afraid of setting a precedent. Well, if I let this one go for emotional abuse, then every woman that comes forward, and I just encourage them, look at it case by case. Yeah. But usually I have to just go and advocate, help women tell their story. And if elders if they take the time and week after week they're praying for the woman and hearing her stories, they gain clarity over time. It's just not quick. Yeah. But I just don't have a easy answer. That's all your jobs. Thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Darby, how would you advise us as pastors when the wife is confiding in you and saying, please don't let my husband know I told you this? What do you do then?
You tell them you won't, that you're a safe place, that you'll pray for them, and that when they're ready to come forward with their story and to make changes, that you will figure out how to confront him in a loving, kind, sweet way. Now that can backfire, because I've had women then resent, how come he wasn't disciplined right away, right? But yeah, it's not helpful to them because it's just going to make it so much worse for them at home. Yeah. even though in our flesh, right? I did counseling. I counseled an abusive case on tape in a room full of pastors. It was an observation class, and there were men in the room saying, I just want to stand up and punch him in the face. And these are pastors, right? It's so ugly. It's like your flesh, you want to, but that's not what they need. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Do you find that children are your red flags that people in the church need to be looking for?
Can be, yes. Yeah. Because they exhibit all sorts of, distress behavior. Yeah. And they can't talk about it. Yeah. Because they're afraid. Go ahead.
I once had a woman come to me who had been raped in her honeymoon. At that point, I was so naive and stuff, I'm sorry to give her great advice, but as she must feel out of control, that would not be the point where you would go to your pastor. You would have to ask her permission.
Correct. Say, this is so serious and so concerning. I want to make sure you're loved well. Can we bring him in on this, or do you want to wait? But then if she says I can't, it's too embarrassing, just say, okay, I'll just keep asking you from time to time. Yeah. Go ahead.
When you talk about the loops of information, the way the stories get shared in the context of the local church, talk about controlling that.
Controlling that?
Controlling, literally, I just recently had a meeting that says, don't talk to anyone in the church.
Oh, right, correct.
You can't tell people to do that, but I'm like, you can't share your story anymore. You have a group of 5 people, and that's your people. Yeah. Don't go beyond that. And I thought, am I right or wrong? Because it's getting worse than getting better.
Correct. And I think you give them people that are in their circle. This is who is your community. And other people can be in your community, but they're not privy to that story. But if they're going to, right, abusive people violate boundaries. So you can set it up, but then you can then discipline for them, right? You have to be aggressive with that, though. It's not fun.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Obviously, what I'm hearing, and I think many others are, is this is a highly complex, highly sensitive set of issues. Would you, A, recommend that churches be proactive in this sense? And what I mean is setting up a ministry team or a group of pre-vetted counselors, counseling organizations that can be brought in at a moment's notice.
Correct. It's so ideal to be prepared before somebody comes forward. It's one of the reasons why I wrote that little quick mini book. But yes, even if you can't train everybody, if you can train 3 people in your church to know what to do. If you're a church of a larger size, I've worked with churches of larger size, I actually have a domestic abuse response team. Not all churches can do that. Now, I worked with a church that had a domestic abuse response team. They had 4,000 people, think 25% coming. Once they started to do one case well, what started to happen? Now, all of a sudden, they can't handle it, right? So that's the beauty of the ministry. You do it well, and you'll be doing it all the time. So you have to think that through. How do we sustain it? Yeah. Because they're victims and they're watching. But yes, proactive is even just thinking through talking about divorce from time to time in your session. It's huge. Yeah, go ahead.
How common do you find, or the studies, to what extent have either the abuser or the abused have been abused as children or come out of some intensely dysfunctional home?
Yeah, abusers can have a history of trauma, right? But not all traumatized people turn out to be abusers, so it's not cause, right? So I would say that they're responsible for getting healing for the wounds that they're perpetrating and the wounds that have hurt them. So it just has to be it just has to be complex, and that's why we look at them as a sufferer, a saint, and a sinner, because they've suffered. It's the attitudes they're carrying with them, but it is common. I think boys are like 10 times as likely to become abusers if they've been raised in an abusive home, because that's what they've seen. It's the attitudes they've absorbed. Yeah.